Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure weekly podcast. I'm Kevin Gastola, joined by Rania Kalik. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And I'm very pleased to have, we are pleased to have as our guest, Roberto Lovato, who is a journalist, a member of the Writers Grotto, co-founder of the hashtag Dignidad Libraria, and the author of Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas. And I have it right here, so I can show it off. And thank you for joining us, Roberto.
I'm happy to be with you both.
To begin, I think for those who are not introduced to your story, I wanted to start by the way you open in your book, sharing these words that you have. The machete of memory can cut swiftly or slowly, and you use the imagery or symbolism of the machete to introduce us to your story. And you also write later in this introduction that the machete severs any understanding that epic history is a stitching together of intimate histories. And so to begin our wide-ranging conversation, and we'll probably go into many different areas for those who are listening, but why don't you share some of your background and what led you to this journey where you were telling the story of the interconnection of violence in El Salvador and the United States and how it relates to your own life?
Well, again, thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be back with you all. I'm here in San Francisco right now where I was born. So my journey began here in San Francisco. And I was born into a family of Salvadorans. My father, Ramon, was from Aguachapan, El Salvador, a coffee region of El Salvador. My mom's from a place called San Vicente, a town that gave birth to, that was known as the town of poets and subversives. So like a lot of the people that founded the FMLN guerrillas came out of my mom's hometown. And so unbeknownst to me, any of this stuff, when I was growing up as a kid, my Salvadoran heritage was kind of like a postcard, right? Like a lot of our families. I grew up with a bunch of pictures of my mom's family, grandmother, aunts, sisters, uncles, nieces, nephews, dogs on my mom's side of the family. But on my dad's side, there was only one picture of my grandmother. And so I grew up with a lot of secrets about my dad's life. And my dad had this other thing. We grew up working class, crowded immigrant household with up to 12 people in the apartment there on Folsom Street next to the projects. And, my dad was involved in the underworld of the Mission District, of the contraband. My dad used to run guns to El Salvador. My dad had guys that would call us up and there's really raspy voices, and I didn't like it. And so, there's that aspect, and then there's just, my own journey after rebelling against my dad, then literally becoming a rebel, joining the FMLN guerrillas in the early '90s, towards the latter part of the war, and then, starting Central American Studies, becoming a journalist, and finally getting to the point where I meet this kid in 2015. Whose story just moves me so much that I decide, okay, it's time for me to tell my story, because I know the background to this story that's being told in the United States superficially. And so there begins my journey into all these different underworlds, right? Because it's an underworld journey into my family history, into my, into the gang hideouts that I go to, into the guerrilla life, into the underworld of countries like El Salvador and the United States, who conduct all these massive crimes against humanity under cover of democracy. So that's kind of a little bit of the journey that I go into.
I think it's really interesting, the timing of your book, because it came out, not that I want to bring everything back to Donald Trump, but or you but it came out at the end, near the end of the Donald Trump administration, when a lot of the kinds of things you're talking about, which have played out over the years, and U.S. policy has had a major effect on them, we've seen a lot of like concern and discussion in the news about the issue of countries from Latin America and immigration and refugees. So I guess, you know, as we come to the close of the Trump administration and the beginning of a Democratic administration, how do you feel like, do you feel like people are going to lose interest in these kinds of issues because this like blatant racist who's so open about what America does to its neighbors in the South is, you know, it's going to be a new administration that isn't so blatant anymore?
Excellent question from a fellow news junkie. Like I know you. And that's a great question because I started writing this book in the Obama era in 2015 when I'm in this immigrant prison with children that were, you know, being imprisoned and their friends were being caged and some of their friends were being separated from their mothers. They were living in extreme terror to the point where some kids that were in the Carnes prison where I was had tried to hang themselves. And you could see the little scars on their necks. And some mothers tried to slit their wrists. And because things were so horrific in this, basically an immigrant gulag, I don't use the word detention center except in quotes. So, I mean, I wrote the book because I have a story to tell that transcends, you know, the moment. But I was very cognizant of the fact that the way the story of immigration is told in a Democratic era is very different from the way it's told when a Republican like Trump is in power. And so, as I've documented in the Columbia Journalism Review and in other places, and especially in my book, there are beneath the story of the caged and separated children, that was one of the biggest stories of 2018, you'll both recall, is the deeper story of Salvadoran history and the U.S. influence on El Salvador's history and its violence, and the history of violence in the U.S. So, yeah, I knew that if there was a Democrat elected, my book would carry through because it tells a deeper story that transcends party, just like immigration policy transcends party. Both parties have caged, separated, and killed migrant children with impunity. Both supported wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, counterinsurgent, destabilization programs, and they put military bases in Honduras. None of this gets told in the story of these kids in cages. It's just evil Trump caging children, and that's simplistic narrative has proven dangerous to the point of like, you know, being kind of, I would even say fascistic in the way that it's erased when Democrats are in power.
So, you know, along those lines, I think since we're here in this arena, why don't we tackle it now, and then I'll come back to these questions I have from your book. So I want to use this technology that I have and put up your tweet that that you shared about what is going on with the Biden transition and how they have considered abandoning any sort of interest in taking care of immigration. You know, so I have your words up here mentioning that Biden Harris are already throwing immigrants and immigrant rights under the bus, and he'll dismantle the Trump executive orders. You say have Lin-Manuel Miranda write a song about it, and then continue and expand the core catastrophic practices of the Obama-Trump continuum. But what you're joking about here.
Actually, it's not necessarily a joke because it will happen. Lin-Manuel Miranda will write a song about it. Like, that's not far off from reality.
No, I mean, it's
like it's sadly
close. It's fairly close to the truth. But just so I get in here, what you were commenting on, there's a report that Biden intentionally did not include immigration in his top 4 priorities because the Biden camp and the transition team feel immigration activists had become too adversarial. So this is obviously to continue this bipartisan pandering and friendship that Biden has with Republicans. So I'll let you comment on what you think this signals for the next 4 years, knowing what you've already brought up here about the fact that the Obama administration was responsible for this send the message kind of campaign, right, where we were shipping the children back and trying to make sure that their parents and children who were trying to escape violence in Central America didn't come to the United States and consider it as a place where they could seek refuge.
Well, I think what we can expect is a variation on the theme of the Obama years and immigration, which is, on the one hand, continuing the Bush policies, because I don't want to just lay everything on Obama, but what Obama did was take things like something called 287G and secure communities, that are the policies that are primarily driving the criminalization of migrants and the jailing and the deportation of and turning police into ICE agents, basically, right, throughout the country. So candidate Obama promised to eviscerate those immediately. Instead, President Obama took these marginal programs and expanded them to every jurisdiction in the land, thereby becoming the record-breaking deporter, the record-breaking jailer, the record-breaking militarizer of the border up until Trump. And even Trump hasn't caught up to many of Obama's. And what's one of the things that makes Donald Trump sad right now is he didn't break a lot of Barack Obama's records on horrific immigration policies as much of his rhetoric did. So I think with Biden, we can expect more of the same. Except you're gonna see now the what I call the aspects of intersectional empire, right? Having women of color like Kamala Harris dancing, eating pupusas on television, making you feel really good. Hey, it's a new day. And or I don't know what they're gonna come up. I don't know if they're gonna repeat "Si se puede," yes we can, or they're gonna come up with their own jingle. They're going to have more brown faces. You have people celebrating. A lot of Latinos are celebrating. Hey, Alejandro Mayorkas is the head of Department of Homeland Security. Yes, we can. Okay, well, why not remember that that's a fascist domestic intelligence and militarization of the country under Homeland Security that is destroyed, occupied, that surveils many of us, non-citizen and citizen alike, and that is responsible for the militarization of the society that Black Lives Matter is fighting. Like Obama, gave a lot of military hardware through Homeland Security to local police forces. So we're going to see initially announcements of ending the Muslim ban, yay, and ending, some of the more draconian and obviously draconian and racist policies like, putting people at the border to have to wait. But the core programs that jail, deport, and kill migrants, the institutions like Homeland Security and ICE will remain intact and possibly be expanded. Okay, but under cover of intersectional empire. That's my prediction. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, intersectional empire. I like that. And I think on top of what you're saying, the underlying policies that have created these waves of migrants for the last several decades will continue. I don't think you're going to see policy shifts at all, really, when it comes to the ongoing efforts to destabilize governments in places like Venezuela and Nicaragua, on top of also continuing to arm right-wing governments in Honduras and Colombia.
Right-wing, I'm sorry to correct you, but right-wing narco governments.
Narco governments, right, of course.
Like the government of Honduras, whose president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was, is named in U.S., courts in New York by the DEA, by DEA lawyers, by federal prosecutors of the U.S., because his brother is a convicted criminal, narco. So these are the bringers of democracy that Obama supported, that Trump supported, that Biden will continue to support. So yeah, as you know, Rania and Kevin, I've been on your show before. I was almost killed because of some of the fascists that the Obama administration was supporting in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. I was, persecuted. I was spied on. I had calls from people that were very shady in the State Department, that had like Captain America type voices and who were obviously like linked to the CIA or
I
NSA
like
or
that
something.
Captain America like voices. That's a funny description.
No, I kid you not. I'll name him, in fact, because I have a recording of his voice. The guy's name is Agent Mike Ranger, believe it or not. Yeah, this is really Captain America voice.
His real
And
name?
he was calling me because he heard that I had gotten death threats. And I was like, oh, that's really great, Agent Ranger. There's just one problem. I didn't report this to the authorities. How do you know this? Well, I'm not at liberty to tell you, sir, Captain America said. Well, I'm not at liberty to keep talking with you, man. And I hung up. So, we know the Democrats well in foreign policy and domestic policy. On the immigration front, you're going to hear they're going to tout this zombie they've been trotting out since 2004. It's called comprehensive immigration reform.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to use that to say, well, our efforts are focused on bringing comprehensive immigration reform. That's cover, and they have a whole infrastructure with groups like the National Immigration Forum, America's Voice, what used to be National Council of La Raza, Center for Community Change at one time. I don't know if they're still kind of rightward leaning, but groups like this and others, they're basically providing cover for the administration. And you have newer groups like Families Belong Together that was created by Democratic Party operatives. You can look up in Glamour magazine, for example, who founded that organization. And something like 6 or 7 out of 10 were ex-Obama campaign or ex-Obama administration or ex-Clinton campaign operatives. So you have a very sophisticated operation on immigration, not just with the right-wing Republicans, but with the Democrats. And so what doesn't change with either of these operations is the core structure of policing, persecuting, migrating, jailing, killing migrants. That, unless you dismantle ICE, the Border Patrol, and Homeland Security, you're not really going to see the thing move. My great hope is the immigrant rights movement. And I do have great hope because we have to have some sense of possibility, some ideal that we're pursuing to engage in the necessary fights. Otherwise, why fight?
Do you think that I keep saying this, but one of my only pieces of optimism moving into the Biden administration on issues like this in particular are that he won't be given that kind of honeymoon period that Obama was given when he was elected. Obama was deporting so many people, but for a while people were too enamored by him and like mesmerized by him and really scared to criticize him because he was like the first Black president. But in Joe Biden, you don't have that. So I feel like from day one, I hope at least from day one, Joe Biden will have, at least grassroots pressure, against whatever his immigration policy is going to be, which is basically what you just laid out.
There'll be pressure and there'll be the AstroTurf and
right.
Or maybe not just AstroTurf, but there'll be the groups that are aligned. You're going to see a lot of brown and Black faces at the very top, right, in the different agencies fronting, as we saw previewed in the Obama era with people like Cecilia Munoz, and Jay Johnson. Jay Johnson was one of the main critics of Trump caging, separating, and children and mothers, right? But NPR and other news organizations forgot to mention that Jay Johnson was actually the innovator of the practice of caging, separating tens of thousands of migrant children and mothers. The media forgot that, and they make ex-Obama officials the main spokespeople. You can see it in my Columbia Journalism Review piece, the 2018, where some volunteers and I documented who the main spokespeople were, and the people that weren't in the story were people, Central Americans, because you don't want people like me or Lacey Abrego or Suyapa Portillo or Stephen Osuna, Jorge Cuellar, and other scholars and journalists and activists of the Central American community speaking to Central American truths. So this is, again, why I came back. I needed to write the book, because I wanted to set the record straight. Hey, you know what? We can actually tell our own story.
And you mentioned
oh, sorry.
Well, so
that's exactly what I was going to bring up.
Well, I'm glad that we're going to get him. See, so I want you to talk about this guy who has very clearly like not Latino features. He looks really white, and
he's
so
the son of his father was he owned a steel wool factory in pre-revolutionary Cuba. That's really all you need to know about him.
But
basically like a slave owner. He owned a factory in pre-revolutionary Cuba. You're a slave owner.
So he was a spokesperson for the Obama administration when they were doing their Send the Message campaign to send all of these people back to Central American countries that they didn't want here. And so I just wanted to get your reaction to how he has ownership of some of these more destructive policies, like what they called expedited removal, which is just deportation, putting people in these gulags, which they call family detention centers, the fast tracking of asylum seeking cases. I mean, there's a lot of attention to Donald Trump and what they've done to destroy the process of trying to obtain asylum. But it was horrific when Obama left. It was already in complete tatters in the couple of years before Obama left as president. Not to mention, even though this may not, I mean, some of it probably impacts you, but at USCIS, the Customs and Immigration Service, he was in charge of, and the ACLU has a full report on this. He would have been in charge of a blacklist for those seeking citizenship in the United States. That affected Arabs, Middle Easterners, people in Africa, people all over the world who were attacked based on their nationality. He was involved in this kind of, I mean, it's kind of McCarthyist to a degree, because they're just looking at certain characteristics and reducing them and denying them the ability to seek citizenship.
So, yeah, you have in Alejandro Mayorkas a right-wing Cuban Democrat. I encourage people to look at the board of directors of organizations like Latino Victory Fund. Look at who's on the board of directors. Look at their backgrounds. Google them. You'll see in the Latino corners of the establishment Democratic Party, the kinds of, kind of new thinking that they're bringing us into the Latino community. So you have people that were affiliated with, a right-wing fascist Venezuelan government that staged a coup with George Bush's help back in the early 2000s against Hugo Chavez. You have, right-wing Puerto Ricans that helped, Obama and the Democrats consolidate the colonization of Puerto Rico with something called the Promesa Act, right? Including Lin-Manuel Miranda's father, Luis Miranda, who's got an HBO special about him, coincidentally. So I joke about Lin-Manuel Miranda, but it's actually not a joke. These are the ways that the lack of real fundamental difference between the policies of Trump and the policies of the Democrats are staged, literally staged, performed, and say, hey, I just saw a special about Lin-Manuel Miranda's dad. He's a solid Democrat. This is better than Trump, right? They're not racist. But you got to get beyond that crap if you're going to save the world at this point. We really do have to kind of look. And so Alejandro Mayorkas follows this. I think, you look at the way he was greeted in certain sectors of the Latino United States, and I was embarrassed by all these people who didn't even notice that Homeland Security is like this neo-fascist structure. And so, Mayorkas will, this is why I came up with this idea of intersectional empire, right? It's like, they've learned how to use gender, race, sexual orientation to advantage. And you even have all these groups that are Latino, Black groups, trans groups, even queer groups that are pro-Biden and Democrat, right? And you have these divisions in our community where you have right-wing Muslims and you have Muslims that are critical of the Democrats, right? You have right-wing Latinos and you have Latinos who are critical of Democrats, and on and on. So we need to. I mean, the good news is I think we're going to see solidarity make a powerful comeback and occupy its place at the center of our politics. Solidarity within the United States between Black and Latino groups and others, and solidarity between us in the U.S. and people in the South. I'm encouraged by this, and I see the potential and the opportunity.
I agree with you on that, and I'm generally pretty pessimistic, but I actually agree with the optimism there on those fronts. And I do think it's important what you said about recognizing the differences between these different communities. Like I can speak from, the Arab American community. There's a huge difference. Not everybody's on the same page. There are right wingers, there are liberals, there are left wingers, and we don't all agree. And I think because, these are positions that are being appointed by Joe Biden rather than people being elected for the first time. Like I think the identity politics does work to sort of silence criticism on the left, but only if the person who's elected is like breaking some new glass ceiling. But Joe Biden didn't break any new glass ceiling, so it doesn't really matter. I don't think it's going to silence critics because he appointed Alejandro Mayorkas to head the DHS.
Try.
What? I'm sorry?
They'll try,
but I don't think I just don't think it has the same level of power. Like I think there was something about, Obama being elected that's obviously much different than Joe Biden appointing the first Latino to head DHS. And I also think it's laughable. It's like laughable that you're going to have a Latino just like overseeing this, as you call, like neo-fascist organization. But I do think that there's going to be pushback to that. But of course, it's not going to be like it was under Trump. Like I do think a lot of liberals are going to care. They're not going to care anymore. Like they've been screaming about children in cages only because Donald Trump was doing it. But now once Democrats are doing it again, they're just going to go back to sleep. But I don't think that's going to be the case for everyone.
Yeah, no, I can tell you that in July of 2009, I was among probably less than a handful of people that were willing to criticize Barack Obama's immigration policies on national television. 5 months after he was elected, I was on Democracy Now! And I basically said, here's Arti Shahani and I were on Democracy Now! And we were like talking about secure communities and 287G, things that nobody even knew about because they weren't geeking out and involved in the policy issues of immigration. But we were documenting and pointing to the nefarious future that we were brought back as early as 2009. And I got like people telling me, man, you know what? You're racist against Black people for criticizing Obama. You are offending the Black community by criticizing Barack Obama. You are, you are this, you are that. And I just kind of like, I've been through 2,500 miles and 30 years of war, genocide, gang violence, mass graves, death threats across the fucking continent, quite frankly. So I bring a little bit of history to these matters, and I know how to hold my ground in the face of criticism like that. Like I'm sure you all are getting a taste of with the kind of edgy things that you do. So I think we're growing into a new age where we're going to have to help create a new kind of younger leadership that's able to navigate these complicated things, political matters, with intelligence and power.
I think that's a really important point. And I'd like to have you get into an event that features in your book. And I will say that I like the way you spend time in different eras of your personal life and your family's life in order to tell this story. It's broken up. It's not a linear narrative, and you take us into different segments. And the event that I wanted to bring in here is just because it was, not to say that the Democrats weren't interested in going after gangs in these Central American countries. It's usually been the excuse for a lot of U.S. intervention and to justify their involvement. But obviously, as high as they could kick it up to. Donald Trump was MS-13, MS-13, MS-13 every single day. And so you cover this important event. You describe the efforts to broker a truce between MS-13 and this other gang, the 18th Street Gang, in 2012, by Raul Mijango or Mijango? Mijango. Thank you for correcting me. And so, can you describe this leader? You sought him out in the book. We follow you as you're seeking him out. You want to know what he thinks about the violence, why kids are turning to these gangs, but also importantly, this truce falls apart because the United States won't support a gang truce, and I think that's an important component for you to highlight for us all as well.
Yeah. I did my first event with Mike Davis, the brilliant, one of the only MacArthur geniuses who's actually a genius. Okay. Mike Davis is a good friend of mine, many years. And I remember with Mike, we were talking about the gangs right during the LA riots and what was happening. And we, many people don't recall, but we do, that LAPD and the FBI were actively trying to prevent the Crips and Bloods from coming together from having a truce. So that signaled to us, oh, okay, these folks do not like peace. Not just they don't like peace in Central America and El Salvador, they don't like peace here in the United States. So the two are connected, right? That's what I'm trying to connect in the book. And so, I met with a top level gang leader in this secret hideout where, you're talking about one of maybe 5-6 people who's politically at the top of a group of about 70,000 gang members. So, and this guy was involved in negotiating a truce with the government that fell apart. His name was Santiago. There's a story about him in the New York Times after I wrote about it in the Boston Globe, by the way, but nobody remembers that. So Santiago, was at the top of the killing chain and negotiating peace that actually held. It was a controversial peace because it was fraught with problems and there were very Salvadoran problems that you have to read the book to kind of get at the complexities of, history and polling that says people don't want negotiation, and the history of violence in El Salvador and government corruption and the FMLN becoming a political party versus becoming an insurgent force, like when we were involved in it. So yeah, Santiago kind of shares with me some sense of his perspective on things, and the United States was implicated in it because he knew that the United States was training police and the military. I've spoken to a lot of people, and I put one of the quotes from someone else. I didn't get it, but a scholar got this. But I put it at the beginning of my book. It says, "Now everyone is a gang member or a terrorist or a narco trafficker. Maybe next they will go back to just being communists." So that's from Aida Luz Santos de Escobar, a former judge in El Salvador. And I put that in there because it reflects the way that I talk about the Obama-Trump continuum, but there's a longer continuum in the history of the United States with El Salvador that says, whether it's gangs, whether it's communists, whether it's nuns, priests, we don't care. We need war. We need perpetual war in the ways that people like Gore Vidal used to describe very eloquently, right? And so I show that in its Salvadoran manifestations by meeting with Santiago, the gang member, but I also show it in its the way it worked in 1992 in LA during the riots when the gangs start escalating their violence because of LAPD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just for context, can you bring it back, because I presume that some of why you joined the FMLN had to do with what you thought it could be as a liberation force, and of course it is being targeted by Ronald Reagan's administration very aggressively, with some figures who lurk around Capitol Hill and the White House still today. You mentioned Bill Barr in your book. Rudy Giuliani is making trips to El Salvador still today in order to interfere in and stir up violence. So, can you close that loop and connect us to that part of our history?
Yeah, I do it through my own story partly, right? I'm a U.S. born Salvadoran, right? My parents from El Salvador. I'm born here in San Francisco, not far from where I am right now on Mission Street. And so, as a working class kid, I started learning about El Salvador, and I started going there, became an activist, did stuff and did humanitarian work in like displaced zones and zones where refugees populations are, and started seeing what people in the countryside who really, really lived the war were going through. And I was just taken aback that the government of the United States, my government, and the government that that my passport and my experiences under was doing this in the 1980s and 90s. And I was like, I decided I couldn't sustain calling myself an American. I couldn't sustain just doing humanitarian work in the face of, a fascist military dictatorship, bombing, strafing, bayoneting children to death, and wiping out entire towns like El Mozote, where in a matter of hours, almost 1,000 people were killed by the U.S. trained military Atlacat battalion. Right, they were trained, and their leaders were trained, and many of their top people were trained at the School of the Americas, right, Fort Benning, Georgia, and they sent trainers to El Salvador as well to train killers. So, as a result, this town of El Mozote, 1,000 people, half of the people in that town were children under 12. Half of the children under 12 were under 6. So learning about, and then actually meeting families, hearing stories, seeing bodies, seeing bombing, seeing the most awful things there are, but also seeing not just seeing the most ignoble things, but seeing the most noble things there are. I decided I'm going to join and do something about this. And I became an urban commando, and we were, focused on infrastructure and sabotage and whatnot. So I came back to the United States and did refugee work. And so I started working in Los Angeles right before the LA riots, right before the peace accords in 1992. And in the book, what I do, and this is where it comes full circle, right, where I started seeing this thing that I eventually end up calling the circuit of counterinsurgency policing, right? So those military trainers that I referred to that trained the fascist military dictatorship, where did the U.S. send those Pentagon trainers after the war in El Salvador? They sent them to LA, they sent them to Portland, they sent them to different police departments to train domestic police in counterinsurgency policing, in targeting gangs, for example. And so when you start seeing the gangs in Los Angeles getting more violent, they're being pushed by this new model of policing that was being pushed by the Pentagon and with the help of people like Daryl Gates and Bill Bratton in Los Angeles. Bill Bratton, who joined Rudy Giuliani in instituting the theories of this guy, I think his name is Julius Wilson from UCLA, who came up with this idea of broken windows policing. So then after the war in El Salvador, they sent people from the Justice Department to help the new Salvadoran police after the peace accords to learn broken windows policing. But in El Salvador, broken windows policing combines with death squad history to create this new Frankenstein monster that was killing gangs like the ones that were described by the top level gang member I was interviewing. And so Rudy Giuliani and the gangs are now being deported to El Salvador in 92 because Bill Barr was the head of the Justice Department, right? And what we call the Immigration Naturalization Service back then was under Bill Barr, as was the Justice Department that was sending the trainers. So Bill Barr, his fingerprints were all over the post-war disaster of El Salvador. And so then later on, they send Rudy Giuliani as a consultant on policing issues, paid like $1 million contracts that were even criticized by some of the right-wing fascists in El Salvador. Said, we already know how to do this. Why do we need Rudy Giuliani?
Rudy Giuliani, America's mayor. Do you guys remember when he was America's mayor?
Hey, you know what? I actually posted on Twitter that I wanted him to get well because he's been the source of such joy and humor for me in the latter part of 2020. I don't want anything to happen to him. I want more of that.
Yeah.
The thing leaking on his face, the press conference, you know, the fart. I mean, goddamn, you can't pay for that kind of epic comedy on HBO or anywhere else, man. I mean, so we have to have Rudy somehow doing something into 2021 because he's just such a joy to watch.
But I do think it's funny though, because it's like I don't think he's ever been a different person. I think that like everybody liked him until Trump, and then now it's easy to make fun of him. But like I think he was always a piece of shit. We all think we all know he was always a piece of shit. But like the only reason liberals think he's a piece of shit is because he went pro-Trump.
Well, how do you really feel about him? That's what I want to know.
I think I know. I'm not very good at expressing my feelings about people like this, but and then you mentioned Bill Bratton, and that just like I get triggered by by these people's names. I like forgot. I don't have to forget they existed, but they did, and they existed under.
Democratic. That's why I put this stuff in the book, so people would understand that we're dealing in a global world, right? I mean, in addition to Pentagon trainers, you had trainers, people training the death squads in the military from Israel, from Taiwan, Argentina, some French trainers who were responsible for the Algerian, death squads and innovating the Algerian death squads. Were training the School of the Americas. They were sent to the School of the Americas. So there's these circuits and now you have a time where it's not just the militaries, but it's also the policing, because policing is becoming more militarized. I document this in the book, how you got this, what I call the RoboCopization of the uniforms, right? You start seeing, the thin kind of, uniform becoming this big inflated RoboCop thing. Well, that's policies that are behind that are militarizing the police and turning them into a counterinsurgency force that sees the population of poor oppositional dissent as potential terrorists and whatnot, worthy of surveillance, jailing. I mean, just consider, for example, in Portland when we saw those people being picked up right in the streets by what were known as BORTAC units that nobody knew about, except people like Todd Miller and me who geek out on, kind of like the militarization of the border.
Yeah, I hadn't even heard of BORTAC until you guys started talking about it.
So BORTAC units were sent instead of the police because Trump wanted to go around the prohibitions of the Posse Comitatus Act that prevent the military from coming in to cities and operating, right? So they brought BORTAC units that are SWAT units, basically, and militarized heavily to come in and without any identification, sweep people up, push them into vans, and take them without reading their rights or anything. Well, that's straight out of those BORTAC units were trained beginning in 2015 at the School of the Americas. Okay, so they were getting training from the people that were anonymously pushing Salvadorans into vans, unmarked vans, like the ones that try to pick me up. Like I was pursued by death squads, as you'll see in the book, and then stuffed in there and taken away. And so you see, again, this is what I mean by the circuits of counterinsurgency policing. And I would say counterinsurgency and militarized policing. And we have to be aware of the way this thing works. It's not just, we can't just have the borders of the United States bordering our political consciousness, because we're going to be doomed to fail in our analysis and therefore in our practice.
So let me ask the question, since it's something that was part of your pursuit. Why are these younger teenagers joining these gangs? I mean, I imagine that it's very similar to why people in the United States, why you have these communities where young teenagers are joining gangs. I'm sure it's probably very similar, but specifically as you would tell it in your story, your United States story that involves, your links to El Salvador, why has this become such a big part of Salvadoran life?
Well, they're a big part of U.S. life, for one. You got to remember first, the Salvadoran gangs were born in Los Angeles, right? The structure, the rituals, the organization of the gangs was basically cut and pasted from the Crips and the Bloods and the Mexican Mafia in Los Angeles.
Right,
Because
right. Yeah, that's the point you make in your book, that it's interconnected. We really can't separate it.
you can't separate it. And so, I mean, I bring a little bit of my own story, which as a journalist, I never thought I would do. But then I thought, my dad's got this really heavy story. And I kind of have this story that could be help people understand things like why people join a guerrilla army or why people join gangs. I wasn't in a hardcore gang because I didn't join one like that when I was an adolescent, but I did join a little clique called Los Originales. So I bring the reader on that journey to understand that my conflicts with my father, my working class origin, the policing of me and my friends, right? The arbitrary beatings, arbitrary arrests, trumped up charges, and profiling that were already well established by the time I was an adolescent in the 80s. So I bring the reader to that to understand that that's not so different from what makes kids join gangs now. But things are especially bad now following the Reagan era, I think, because you got to remember here in the United States, Reagan dismantled CETA and all these urban development programs of the war on poverty that weren't perfect, but they provided community centers, parks and recreation, jobs programs, child care and other things that help working class families make a go of it instead of having these not just food deserts, but we're talking about park and recreation deserts like LA, where there's large swaths of concrete and no park, no greenery, no jobs, no. So this is what economics at its core is what makes for a gang. I mean, you've got, when you've got a population of a large and young population with no opportunity structure, then you're going to have kids seeking alternatives. I mean, it's, as I wrote in the book, in El Salvador, there's also an economic component to belonging to a gang, like something on the order of 500,000 families, 500,000 people in El Salvador, which was a population of about 6 million when I was writing the book in 2015, are dependent on their gang member kids for income. And when you're talking about Salvadoran gangs, you're not talking about gangs that are involved in the narco economy, like say the gangs in Honduras or the gangs in Guatemala, because they're in the, or like the narco groups in Mexico. They're like in the pathway of the circuits of drug trade, where El Salvador is not. So the gangs are a very different thing in El Salvador than they are from the more narco influence groups, and so people confuse this. And so I just I wrote the story to show this complexity in the way things work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would throw in my own experience following what happens in the city of Chicago, because that's something that gets a lot of attention by Donald Trump, pointing to the gang problem here. And I mean, Rahm Emanuel, who was up for a position in the Biden administration, shuts down almost I think a clear majority of mental health clinics get shut down. You have 50 schools closed in one fell swoop. And when you do that kind of thing, it's no accident that people will join these gangs for their very survival, right?
Right. For survival, for company, for I mean, like, I again, that's where the story with me and my dad is, I think, really important to, I hope, building understanding about some of these things. Like, I love my dad. I one of the great things about writing a book is I came up with an arc for my life and relationship with my dad. And it's love my dad as a young baby and child, love and hate my dad, and then as an older adolescent, love, hate, and rebel against my dad and the Salvadoran state, and then eventually love my dad again. So these are the kinds of dynamics that I think inform the dynamics of the gangs, where you have absent fathers, absent violent fathers in many cases, abusive fathers. My father was one of them, and I had to come clean about that. But I think I did it in a way that also shows the complexity of my dad, working class guy and doing what he could, and why I love my dad now, despite his limits.
Yeah,
So
and if I want to let Rania get back in here before we wrap, but what you're saying there reminds me of this really great part of your book that struck me, where again I'm going to say it wrong, but Miango, right? Miango mentions that the FMLN and the gangs is as much of an emotional problem as it is a political one. And so I think that's something that your book does a really good job of exploring, like beyond the politics. What's the, right? I guess in one way it's sociological, but what's the psychological impact? What's the toll of this on people in ways that are not just seen? I mean, this is something that runs throughout a lot of the violence in the 21st century. This psychological kind of torment and the rampant violence that's built around. I mean, obviously, post 9/11, the war on terror, some of the worst violence was deliberately made to not have scars so that people would not get in trouble. So it would be nearly impossible. So, not only do you have the butchering of people, that sort of death squad, the standard run of the mill violence that has become hallmarks of what we see from these groups, but it's that psychological impact that that is going to always be very difficult for these people to grapple with and improve to others. That is what they're enduring. Am I correct?
absolutely. I mean, you mentioned earlier the structure of my book, and I consciously jump across time and space from one chapter to another, and I think I succeeded because people say I succeeded. It was a difficult task, to say the least, to write that way, from every chapter jumping from one time into one space into another, like a grasshopper. I did that because I wanted people to understand, like I came to understand in the course of living and then writing the story, that there were things at work in my life that I didn't even know were there. Inherited trauma being one of them. I don't use the word trauma. I show it in the book, right? I show what I inherited. Literally, that's part of what the book's about. But beyond that, the book's also about an understanding that I gained about the nature of war and violence. And like in the case of war, I know that any national security operative at the highest levels is very focused on psychology. They're not focused on the guns and the bombs. They're focused on what the guns and the bombs and the helicopters and tanks will do to a population and to their adversaries. So, by the same token, I also wanted to show the spirit that can overcome the greatest military on earth, and everything that it did to El Salvador. The insurgent spirit was not killed. I was not killed. My insurgent spirit was not killed, neither was the insurgent spirit of so many Salvadorans who continue doing social justice in El Salvador, in labor unions here in the United States, in churches, in nonprofit organizations, in immigrant rights, in many movements. Salvadorans continue to play important roles in ways people don't even know, and they don't even know the history. So, there's a deep undercurrent of psychology and spiritual matters that we as on the left really need to kind of grapple with too, because too often it's our conceptual and ideological apparatus that guides us, and we don't pay attention to the spiritual part that will sustain us before the challenges we face right now. And I'm not just talking about COVID or the decline of the US economy or Trump fascism. I'm talking about, even if we get beyond that, you've got climate change right there waiting for us. So we're going to need some spiritual sustenance, and that's kind of the spirit that I put into the book and that I try to articulate and express.
I think that's really beautifully said. And I really want to thank you. I think you're one of the most consistent voices. We've had you on our show several times in the past few years, and under whatever administration is in charge, you really stay consistent in your message. And that's always, I think, really important and appreciated and should be acknowledged, because it's not always easy. Either, especially professionally. I imagine that there's a lot more opportunities for you to just kind of, go along with the Democratic Party line. And pushing back
Thank
against
you.
it doesn't make you friends or get you favors.
Thank you
So
for
I want to
saying
thank you.
that.
I just want to thank you for that. I think that's a really important
Oh,
thing that should be recognized.
thank you for saying that, Ronnie. I really appreciate what you all do too. And yeah, if I had chosen a more mediocre path, I'd be a richer man than I am today. But I chose another path in my life, and I've held my ground now and I want to die that way, right? I met some great revolutionaries that live up to what Bertolt Brecht and then later the great troubadour, Cuban troubadour, Silvio Rodriguez said, which is that there are those who fight one day and they're good. There are those who struggle many days and they're very good. And there's those who struggle many, many days and they're very, very good. And then there are those who struggle their entire lives. Those are the essential ones. So my goal in life is that I don't want to stop struggling. I want to go out, with the greatest ambition that I have sustaining me through the course of whatever we face. And I think that's sometimes the best we can do. And that's the work right now is, this is going to go on beyond my lifetime. So I am getting at an age 57 where I have to start dropping as much knowledge as I have about things like revolution and politics and literature and writing. I think they're really and culture because I think they're important to sustainable struggle.
You'll always have a space here to come drop knowledge and talk about revolution and politics and culture. We don't have a problem with any of that, especially if it sticks it to the powers that be. And so, thank you. Again, I'm gonna actually let me take space here for a second. This is the book. It's called Unforgetting, a Memoir of Family, Migration, Gangs, and Revolution in the Americas. It's by Roberto Lovato. And so thank you. We really appreciated being able to talk with you.
My pleasure and honor, and thank you for your kind words and your work.